Warning, the following video may contain sequences which some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
I want to talk about abusive relationships to start this one off. Doesn't really matter whether it's physical or emotional, but let's start looking at some numbers for domestic violence among couples in the US. On average, about 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner. That would equate to over 10 million people in a year, and only about 34% of the victims in such situations receive medical attention. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience some form of abuse from their partner, whether it be physical, emotional, sexual, and so on. I think that is about accurate as well. It feels like in every group of friends there's always at least one with some sort of story about a crazy ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, wouldn't you say? Let's continue though. On a regular day there's more than 20,000 calls to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. And the last statistic we will mention is 15% of all violent crime are carried out between intimate partners. Clearly, abusive relationships are not new or rare. Some of you watching may have been victims or have even seen for yourself some form of abusive relationship in your lifetime. And if that is the case, I am truly sorry for you having to go through that. It's not pretty, and it can leave a heavy psychological mark on the victims and those who have to witness it as well. So, why am I mentioning this? Is our case today one that involves a killing as a result of domestic violence? Well, it has to do with domestic violence, yes, but the death that occurs today still is yet to have a clear culprit. At the time of this video's release, this case would have been open for 7 years, and it's still open now. Why? What makes a case so complicated that after 7 years a culprit is yet to be found? During our discussion today, we will see why this is the case, and why, unfortunately, it might remain open for quite some time. Today, we go over the Bianca Jimenez case. There's a little bit to unpack before we can go over what happened though, so bear with me for a second. Bianca Jimenez was a 28-year-old woman who lived in the 300 block of Adams and Ganether in the King Williams area, San Antonio. She worked at a salon. At the time of her disappearance, she had recently broken up with her ex-boyfriend of 12 years. We don't know the official reason, but we do have some statements that would confirm that her relationship with her ex was an abusive one. The night she disappeared, she had just gone on a date with someone new actually. Let's talk about how this all went down. James Enger was the man she was with on the night of her disappearance. James stated that he picked her up that evening, then they went to get some drinks, and after they went dancing. After their outing, James drove her back to her apartment, but being a gentleman, he walked her to her door. James said when they got there they started fooling around. Perhaps the two of them just happened to get in the mood. Nothing strange though, this is all normal. He continued to recollect the events of that evening. He said that they continued to fool around, and when they reached the foyer, a man burst out of her apartment and attacked him. "I started getting bludgeoned in the face," he stated as he recalled the night's events. He wasn't able to see his attacker. It was around 1:30 a.m. It was dark. However, James then said that he believes Bianca knew who his attacker was, because while he was getting beaten, she was calling the man by his name and urging him to stop. During this exchange, one of the windows in the foyer was broken, and it's believed that Bianca ended up cutting her hand when she was trying to help James. The next thing James stated was that, at some point the fighting just stopped, and he left. He continued, "The last time I saw her, she was sitting on the living room floor." Now, right at the bat, this sounds odd. Not all of it, him getting beaten, is believable. In fact, there is a picture of him with a black eye from that night. But didn't the way it ended seem weird to you? At some point the fighting just stopped and you left? You just went on a date with a girl. A man bursts out of her apartment, beats the stuffing out of you. I suppose he left when he was satisfied. And then you, as the man she just went on a date with, just leave her there? If the last thing you saw was her sitting on the living room floor, that tells me that she was distressed in some way, shape, or form. I know there's guys out there like that, but it seems like a selfish and insensitive move to me for him to just leave like that. But I digress. Let's continue. The next morning, James sent her a text asking if she was okay. However, he got no reply. James also got a call from a friend who asked if he had seen Bianca, because that morning, she didn't show up to the hair salon she worked at. Bianca's mother, Mary, grew worried when she realized this, and went to Bianca's apartment to check on her. Mary stated, "When I got there, her things were outside on the porch, and there was blood on the inside and outside of the apartment. That sounds like a crime scene to me. Something happened within that apartment the night before, most likely after James left. I have a few ideas on that, but we'll get into that later." Her family tried desperately to search for Bianca. Even when the police ran out of new leads on the investigation, they hired their own private investigator, and even then, nothing. They went as far as to host a fundraiser and offer a cash reward for anything that could help them find Bianca. But still, their efforts were in vain. Bianca was nowhere to be found till 3 weeks later. A body was found along the banks of the San Antonio River by some boys who were fishing. It took the police almost a week to identify her remains. When an autopsy was performed, the results were inconclusive. The manner and cause of death remained unknown. However, the death was being investigated as a homicide. Now, this was mostly all that was given to the public, and it leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Not too long after, her ex-boyfriend was identified as a man named Patrick, and he was indeed the man who attacked James that night. But in all those articles, Patrick was never mentioned once. Not even as a suspect. Couldn't they just look for fingerprints? DNA samples within the apartment, anything that puts people at that crime scene and hopefully find your culprit through that. But there's no report saying anything like that was done. I highly doubt it wasn't though, so it's possible that information was just withheld. We don't know for sure, but let's just assume it was. It's been over 7 years, and nothing at all has been given about this case. It's still open to this very day. Something interesting happened though. In late 2021, a friend of Bianca, or at least someone who claims to be a friend of hers, made a statement online on a thread that spoke about Bianca's case. Her name is unknown, so let's just call her Jane. She explains how she knew Samantha from their school days, among other things. She goes on to explain that they became close after her graduation, and that they spoke about everything. She would also make appointments at the hair salon in which Bianca worked. She stated that at the last appointment she had with her, Bianca was 30 minutes late. According to this individual, Bianca was never that late before. When she finally arrived, she apologized and said that Patrick had broken her phone and there was visible bruising on her arms. It would seem that around this time, the two were not together. Jane, however, could tell that she did not want to go into what happened, so she left it alone. Instead, they spoke about their usual topics during the appointment. I suppose she tried to get her mind off of the situation rather than pry. Jane then relayed her thoughts on the matter. She says she didn't find it odd that James didn't call the police that night. She stated that Bianca loved to drink and really liked to smoke. She suspects James was probably not in the right frame of mind to contact the police. My only issue with that idea is that James drove them back to her home, but let's continue. She says that it's possible that after the fight, after James left, she could have taken off while drunk and high. Jane believes that Patrick could have followed her, and an altercation could have happened that caused her to fall into the river. Now here is a detail that I found particularly interesting. Hours after that entire situation that night, Jane states that there was a thunderstorm. And if she did fall into the river, it could have caused her to drown, and that could have caused further injury to her body. She goes on to say how the wake for Bianca happened, but I don't think we need to go into that. Based on what was given to us from reports, the police, statements from the family, and the most recent statements from our Jane, I can start to see why this case isn't resolved. Consider this. With what Jane said, we know Patrick has been to her house prior to the evening in which she disappeared. Jane suspected that Bianca could have taken off after the fight, but I think the fact that the house had blood both inside and outside tells me a different story. If the police were to find evidence, whether it be DNA or otherwise, that shows Patrick, who is obviously our main suspect, was there in her apartment, you still can't prove he did anything. He was there before. It's not like this was his first time there. If it was his first time there, then it would definitely make it even more likely that he was the culprit. Something else that helps us understand why the autopsy couldn't answer what the cause and manner of her death was, is what Jane said. There was a thunderstorm that night. If we go by what she says, whatever evidence that was on her body could have easily been taken away. Remember, it took almost a week to identify the body as Bianca's after it was found. That tells me that the body was obviously roughed up. Assuming that her body was in the river that night, the current of the water could have done a lot to mask whatever injuries she could have sustained before falling in the river. Her body was found under brush. Besides that, again, if she'd been in that river for 3 weeks, then yeah, any DNA samples that could have been retrieved, hair, skin, blood or whatever else, could easily have been washed away, not only because she was in a river, but because there was a storm going on, which would naturally make the river much more violent. It makes the likelihood of her falling in and drowning a possible reason for her death. If, as Jane said, she took off while she was drunk and high, and a storm happened, the number of bad outcomes that could spring from that scenario is overwhelming. The way I see it, there are a few possibilities that are more likely than others. The first being obviously that the one responsible for her death was her ex. He had motive, and from what Jane told us, a history of being abusive with Bianca. I mean, come on, your girlfriend over 12 years breaks up with you, and the night she finally goes on a date with someone else, you burst out of her apartment and beat him up before fleeing the scene? How did he even get in her apartment to begin with? Had Bianca been by herself, what would he have done to her? I don't think an abusive ex would break into your apartment the night you go on a date with someone new and would only want to have a friendly chat with you over coffee. I can only sense bad intentions from that scenario. James stated that she was sitting on her living room floor when he last saw her. So it's possible that Patrick came back that night, killed her, as there was blood in the apartment, and then dumped her body in the river. And if that's happened, he was extremely lucky the storm covered his tracks that night, and that it took so long for her body to be found, which made it hard to even identify, far less determine a cause of death. Another being what Jane thought about. It's possible that she took off while drunk and high. Patrick could have followed her, things got dicey, and she ends up falling in the river, or maybe he pushes her, causing her to not have any evidence that he even did anything to her. It could also easily make her death look like an accident. Or maybe Patrick really did have nothing to do with it, and she genuinely fell while he was intoxicated. Maybe she got caught in the storm and fell in. There is an infinite number of possibilities, and the way the events played out makes it extremely difficult to identify a clear culprit or reason for her death. Cases like this would need a witness, someone who saw something, or maybe camera footage, but if this happened during a storm, the odds of people being out are low, very low. So a witness is probably just wishful thinking. If this was truly a homicide, then the events of that night just lined up in a way that concealed it perfectly. There's just so many possibilities. Blood in and out of the apartment tells me that it was a murder. Patrick being abusive along with him being there that night, and his actions of that night as well, points to him as the culprit, but you can't convict someone because it looks like he killed someone. You need solid evidence, evidence that cannot be found to this day, or evidence that is not useful. Because of how things played out, I can see why this case is yet to be solved, and if I'm being honest, unless there's a confession or witness or some piece of incriminating evidence that was miraculously missed, then I don't see this case ever being solved, sadly. It's unfortunate, but that's what it's looking like. It's hard to accept an outcome like this to any case. Mary, Bianca's mother, stated that it's painful not knowing what happened to her. I think all of Bianca's loved ones would just want some sort of closure on this entire thing, but again, it really doesn't seem likely. This could have been avoided, it really could have. James left her that night. After something like someone bursting out of your date's house and beating you up, you just leave her there? Alone? Didn't call the police? Even if you're not in the right frame of mind, you had enough sense left in you to drive home, right? So why couldn't you call the police? Honestly, I'm still stuck on the fact that he just left. There's just so many things morally wrong with that. Jane saw the signs of abuse and didn't say anything. Maybe if she did, something could have been done. Maybe she would still be here. I'm not blaming anyone for what happened. I'm just saying that things did not have to happen the way they did. It's just sad to see. Being in an abusive relationship is a horrible thing. The victim in situations like that often feel trapped and unable to get out of it. Some people would claim the answer is obvious, just dump the abuser, and to those people I would say, you've never been in an abusive relationship, or your mindset is different to that of a lot within abusive relationships. I would also say that sometimes breaking up doesn't solve anything. Bianca broke up with Patrick, but as you saw, he never really left now, did he? Sometimes the abuser won't let you leave. Even if you break up with them, they still come around, still show up. Things get even more complicated if there's some sort of love involved. When there's love involved, you don't want to see bad for that person, which is why a lot of times the police don't get involved. And if they do, it's more than likely because of either a third party or the influence of a third party, because again, the victim would not want to see bad for that individual. How could someone love someone who hurts them? Well, the answer to that is beyond me, but sometimes, love makes people do unreasonable things. Perhaps this is one of them. Bianca's death is a truly sad one. The events that led up to it were unfortunate. It's sad that she didn't get help beforehand. If she did, then maybe she would still be here. But what's done is done. And though we don't know exactly what happened to her, I sincerely hope she rests in peace, and that her family and loved ones find some sort of closure in this difficult situation. Death always hurts, but one like this, I feel, stings a bit more.